I think we should.
Wait, didn't we wait for this time?
Zoom is on.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
All right,
Ready? Go ahead.
we are ready. Good evening. Can everybody hear me all right? Is this good? Thank you. So welcome to our panel discussion on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what's happening and why it matters. Before we begin, though, let's acknowledge the place in the land where we are studying. We pause to acknowledge that Santa Clara University sits on the land of the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone people who trace their ancestry through the missions Dolores, Santa Clara, and San Jose. We remember their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homelands. Let us take a moment of silence to pay respect to their elders and to all Ohlone people, past and present. Thank you. So I'm Alison Benders, serving now as the Vice President for Mission and Ministry here at Santa Clara University. I'll be moderating our discussion this evening. So I want to thank everyone for being here with us today. And this evening, both here in the room in Charney Hall, and as well as our colleagues on Zoom. And I also want a special thanks to Dean Kaufman of the law school. He said he'll be participating by Zoom tonight. So I'm really grateful that the law school has given us the space for this conversation. We hope that the conversation tonight can help us make sense of Russia's recent military attack on Ukraine. All of us are aware of the violence unfolding there, the disruption, the suffering that began just days ago. So for tonight, the panel of 3 faculty experts will offer us a deeper understanding of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and we'll also focus on the humanitarian crisis and perhaps what we might do to be able to support the people in need, the refugee crisis that's going on as we watch. So we've scheduled 90 minutes together. Let me just give you a really short plan of what we're going to do. 90 minutes together tonight. The first 45 minutes roughly, we'll have presentations from each of our faculty members, and I'll introduce them to you in a moment. And then after that, we'll have Q&A from you. We'll ask that you identify yourself and speak briefly, but we want to hear your questions and concerns as we go forward tonight. So you should also be aware that we are recording the presentation section of this evening. When we move to Q&A, we'll turn off that recording out of respect for those of you who are participating as an audience. But we will have our faculty recorded so that if you would like to look back on this or share this later, you're certainly welcome to do that. So let me introduce our panel tonight. These are your faculty members here at Santa Clara. So Jane Curry, in the lovely blue, is a professor of political science. She specializes in Central and Eastern European studies, and she studied the former Soviet Union. She did extensive interview research in Ukraine in 2008 and 2009. She's taught Ukrainian students about democracy in a Polish program since 2003 and 2004, nearly every summer since then. She headed a student and faculty exchange between Santa Clara University and Donetsk State University for 4 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union. She's written widely on the topics relating to our discussion tonight. I'd also like to introduce Amy Randall, is a professor of history and the associate director of the Center for Arts and Humanities. She has written widely on Soviet history, gender and genocide in the 20th century, and Russian and Soviet masculinities, including that as expressed by Soviet leaders. Professor Randall's comments will help us understand better the rhetoric that we are hearing in the media these days. And finally, David Sloss is the John A. and Elizabeth H. Sutro Professor of Law. He is an expert in international law. He also has substantial expertise on the Russian military and Russian foreign policy. His comments will address both international law and the military situation in Ukraine. So with that, let's get started. And what I'll ask you to do is to please hold your questions, write them down, and we'll get to them after our three faculty members have given their perspective on what's happening in Ukraine. So Amy, please, Professor Randall. Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Yes, Dr. Curry, please.
I have to admit that when I thought up this program, and David and I talked months ago, I thought the Russian conflict with Ukraine was really a minor tiff, but it seemed worth having a panel to talk about what was happening and how Ukraine was standing up, as well as the international law involved. That was not quite a week ago that we were going to do that. It's turned into a slaughter the likes of which we have not seen in decades. And even as the West has put pressure on Russia, the invaders have become more sadistic in their tactics. Cluster bombs and tanks that shoot out streams of fire are being used now in urban fighting. These are not military to military engagements. They're civilians fighting heavily armed tanks and other military vehicles. I would have said then and want to be clear now that NATO encouraged and helped Ukraine to improve its military and its security sector, but there was never any chance that NATO would take in Ukraine. It has not been willing to take any of the countries east of Poland either. This was to avoid angering Russia and taking the risks that having opposing militaries across a narrow border from each other would bring. And everyone was aware that Ukraine's entrance would cross the Russia's red line. And I do not think anyone was or is ready to do that, even if Ukraine could meet the standards for entrance. Ukraine, though, was one of the first states to join the Partnership for Peace, the sort of minimal commitment of support by NATO. It offered training for effective and restrained military governance. It did not mean there would be NATO troops in Ukraine. There was no real promise to defend it, as there would have been for any country that was a full member of NATO. And to defend Ukraine would risk a nuclear war with Russia. And the Russian attack was unexpected, although there were inordinately large numbers of Russian troops who were massed along Ukraine's border. A week of bombings have been focused on airports and communication centers, most of which are far closer to civilian areas than they would be in the US. So they essentially are attacking civilians. Finally, Ukraine has had relationships with the EU, mostly to encourage it to develop its trade and markets. But Ukraine has not been admitted to the EU either. It can't meet its standards, and the concern has always been Russia's response. I'm going to leave it to Amy Randall to explain Russia's issues further. There are some things you should keep in mind, though, about Ukraine. First of all, Ukraine has always been close to Russia, not just geographically. There are large numbers of Russians all over Ukraine. This began as Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, and because in the Soviet Union, there was an attempt to have Russians in all the non-Russian territories to ensure they did not go a nationalist route. But more than in any of the post-Soviet states, Ukrainians had family and historical ties in the West. So like the Poles, in many areas of the Ukraine, they knew more about how people lived in the West than others in the Soviet Union and now Russia and its buddies. It was in Kiev that the massive Orange Revolution happened. in 2004, when hundreds of people massed on the Maidan and held it for 2 months in the freezing weather to protest in the very center of Kiev election fraud until the Democratic candidate was declared the winner. And at that time, the two candidates were known as the Russian candidate and the Democratic candidate. In the eastern sector, there have been some tiny demonstrations, but most were largely against uniting with NATO and the West. Their candidate has always been tied to Russia. The South and East sector is made up largely of Russian enclaves that are in Ukraine, but most people speak Russian and look to Russia. One of those was the Donbass region around Donetsk, where I must note, Santa Clara had its exchange the last 3 years of the Soviet Union. I often said we must have closed the Soviet Union down. It was a mining area that looked east less than it did west. And that area, along with Crimea, Russia's version of a warm water spa, and port, were the first areas Russia took over this year. They were taken over by Russian troops with little resistance and served as staging places for attacks on other Ukrainian cities. In fact, the Russians initially placed massive numbers of their troops in border regions in Russia and in other areas of Ukraine that had large Russian populations and old ties. They also stationed troops in Belarus, which is run by what many say is the last dictator in Europe, Lukashenko. Initially, they denied these troops were there as a staging ground for an attack. They said these were maneuvers. So Russians were able to set up bases from which to attack with little or no resistance, creating a pincer around Ukraine. But then, and very rapidly, the attacks started, and Ukrainian troops, and more often people, have fought back fiercely, much to the Russians' surprise. But Russia was and is clearly dominant. People in the west of Ukraine have far more identity as Ukrainians than those in the east and south. They benefited from the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism. They were more agricultural areas, and they were more urban, educated areas with fewer huge Soviet manufacturing plants. When communism fell, they had an easier transition to capitalism and democracy and got more Western aid. But it was still not easy. In the East, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the mines often closed and the system did not transition well. So the old days of being with Russia have been remembered well. One of the surprises of this war, and I think one of the reasons it has not been so simple for Russians to take over, has been the leadership of Volodymyr Zelensky. He was hardly a person that people were sure would be a serious leader. Many saw him as a candidate to vote for because he was not an old politician or part of the political crowd. He was a comedian, the Jon Stewart of Ukraine. And as some of my Ukrainian students told me a year ago, it fit because politics and politicians were a joke in Ukraine. He has proved to be a powerful leader when the Russian invasion happened. He refused Western offers to protect him by getting him out of Kiev. Publicly, he said he and Ukraine needed ammunition, not rides. Instead of leaving, he's shown up on all the social media sites calling for people to stand up and fight on. And he made sure that it was clear that he was in Kiev or in Ukraine when he was speaking. And that's inspired people and is one of the explanations that is best for explaining why people have been willing to stand up as they have peacefully, but still stand up against the Russian invasion and to fight in many of the cities. Wisely today, he had the meetings with Russian officials done not by him, but by his defense minister, because there was real concern that if he crossed the line and sat down with Russian officials, he wouldn't come back again. Although Russians have used their ability to break in and use disinformation on internet sites in this battle, and earlier the social media that people, and earlier, the social media that people are posting on from Ukraine has played a major role in strengthening the resistance and getting information out to the West. Those TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook sites are being used to let people know in the cities where fighting is going on, what's happening where. And they've gotten not just the horrific images out to the West, but also the speeches of Zelensky and other leaders out to Ukrainians and people around the world. And I would say the satirical short videos and images individuals post are certainly reinforcing the opposition and the population's courage. Because as they say, if you can't force them back, you can at least weaken them by laughing at them. Another part of the tragedy in Ukraine is that the estimates are that nearly 500,000 Ukrainians are streaming out of Ukraine to neighboring countries. Russia's fine with letting them go. They go almost exclusively to countries that border Ukraine on its western flank. In almost all cases, these are women and children, as the men are not allowed to leave Ukraine as they're needed to fight the Russians. These refugees essentially leave with what they can carry. This is creating massive pressure on the East European states that surround or are on the western flank of Ukraine, Poland, Slovakia, and other countries, but it hasn't decreased their support of Ukraine. I must say that I've heard from many Poles I know well, asking me if I know Ukrainians they can take in and are bringing perfect strangers into their apartments. The pressure is so great of these refugees that US troops and other NATO troops are being used to handle the influx of Ukrainian refugees, at least in Poland. I understand as well that a number of colleges and universities in the US and Europe are offering to take in students and faculty from Ukrainian universities and colleges without full documentation to help them get started. If anything, this is a profile of courage on the part of Ukrainians and the generosity of the West. I'm going to open myself when we finish for questions about what's going on, but I urge you to look at the images of Russian tanks going into cities and of Russian soldiers shooting at civilians who are trying to stand up to their regime or against their invasion. As it stands now, Russian troops control and are not showing signs of leaving. Ukrainians are standing, as I said, their ground. The street fighting of tanks against civilians has produced horrific injuries all over the cities. The bombing of strategic targets that destroy apartment buildings and hospitals and schools are equally horrific. What's next? I'm not sure anyone knows, but perhaps Putin. And I think I'll leave it at that, and then we can go on and talk about the international part, Russia's role in this, and also the legal issues that are involved. Amy?
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. So thank you everyone for coming today. We are living in a horrific moment. We don't know how this will end. I wanted to provide you some historical context for what's going on as a historian and to talk a little bit about two main points, Putin as a leader and how to understand his actions today. And then also to consider some of the language that he's been using. He's been calling for the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. So to provide some historical context for those comments. So let me just first start by saying that when Putin came to power, he replaced Boris Yeltsin as president. And although Yeltsin had been a popular figure during the collapse of the Soviet Union as someone who had stood up to the Soviet Union as the Russian president, stood up to a coup attempt to overthrow reforms, throughout the 90s, he increasingly became a source of embarrassment. He would appear drunk in public and do things like try to take over conducting of an orchestra. There are many stories of him and images of him on the international arena doing these things that made Russians feel quite humiliated and ashamed. He also descended into poor health, had a heart condition, and there was a lot of discussion about the corruption in his own family and behind the scenes. So when Putin took over, one of the most striking things was how different he seemed to Yeltsin. He was young, he was energetic, he didn't drink, he was very athletic, and purposely his PR folks and he himself cultivated this image of Putin as a masculine man, right? The one who could go co-piloting a jet plane or fishing in Siberia without a shirt on, and people would swoon, right? That kind of image of himself as very masculine. And he was healthy, right? So a lot of people looked to him with relief. They thought, this is a strong man who's going to provide a stable way forward and will restore some stability to the economy and political order. And that is what he did do to some extent. So he began to talk about the need to defend Russians against corrupt businessmen and neglectful officials, right? Sort of blaming others for some of the problems that were happening, and which is not to say that there weren't corrupt businessmen or neglectful officials. He talked about the need to defend Russians against Islamic fundamentalist terrorists, which was a real problem, particularly during his first years in power. And there's some question about his role in orchestrating the beginning of the Second Chechen War. But nonetheless, he asserted his ability to save Russians from that threat, despite the repeated threat, but his repeated efforts to stop the bombing attacks and the metros, the apartment buildings, the downing of a jet plane, and so on. He delivered on stabilizing the economy and growing the middle class. There was 7% growth for the first 7 or 8 years he was in power every year, and that was huge. And his goal was to make Russia important and to restore some of its strength in terms of the international arena, and to project an image of a strong Russia, a great Russia, a restored Russia. So how did he do this? Partly he worked with people in the West in terms of trade agreements that were beneficial to Russia. He paid lip service to democracy and democratic institutions. He supported capitalism versus his previous communist leaders. He presented Russia as engaging in a broader global fight against terrorism among so-called civilized countries. But he also insisted on Russia's difference in terms of its values, that it valued a strong state, and that was a positive thing. It valued collectivism over individualism. So yes, it could be in the same playground as Europeans and those in America and other countries associated with democracy, but that Russia was nonetheless different. That was the beginning of his reign. The last 12 to 14 years, because he's been in power for a long time, right, since 2000, he's begun to adopt a different kind of stance vis-a-vis the West, Europe, United States in particular, and projecting an image of strength again, but about the need to stand up to the West, to stand up to NATO expansion, and to stand up against Western values and what he sees as Western ways, traditions, ideas, respect for individual rights that, in his opinion, help to honor groups that should not be honored. So I'll get to that in a moment. But the expansion of NATO is important although Professor Curry pointed out that there were deliberate efforts not to expand NATO to certain countries to try to thwart any kind of negative response on the part of Russia, the reality is that NATO expanded dramatically. And this started in 1999 with former communist Eastern European countries joining NATO, several of them. And then again with another expansion in 2004, 2009, 2017, 2020. Now, from Putin's perspective, that was seen as an act of aggression. And, he thought that there should have been a different kind of security architecture developed after the end of the Cold War. So for him and for his perspective, this was already stepping over the line that Professor Curry was suggesting that many folks in NATO were trying not to step over. Okay. And I will add that the bombing of Kosovo in 1999, in terms of what was going on with Serbia and Kosovo, didn't help matters in terms of the sense of Slavic peoples being besieged by the West and being betrayed by NATO. So these are the ideas of Putin. I'm not saying that he's legitimate in this thinking, right? I'm just trying to present a picture of why he became increasingly aggressive and standing up against the West. He was also against what he considered to be Western intrusion in terms of values. So for example, feminist ideas were a Western import in his imagination. Support for LGBTQ+ rights was something he could not get behind. And there's a lot of discussion in Russia about gayropa, right? That term has emerged. And this idea that there are these values, not respecting the nuclear family, valuing individualism over everything else, and so on and so forth, that he and many other people have talked about as being against Russian values. He also was against what he saw as the infiltration of domestic political groups and organizations in Russia, as well as the infiltration of other groups in other countries that were trying to be more like the West. So Georgia in his mind, or Ukraine in his mind. And I should say that all of this is happening against the backdrop of a wave of protests in 2011, 2012, 2013, in reaction to what many people perceive to be rigged elections and also the rigged re-election of Putin as president. And he said that a lot of the support for this was fomented by the West, right? Western funds, Western politicians, it was Hillary Clinton's fault, and so on and so forth. And also blamed then the democratic uprisings in Ukraine as being funded by the West, as not sort of sincere to the Ukrainian people, not organic. Okay. So part of Putin's strategy has been to save Russia and the Russians and project himself as the protector and the father. Doing so with the war in Chechnya, the war in Georgia, in which he supposedly was protecting the South Ossetians from genocide by Georgians, which is absolutely untrue, a false claim. To protect, Russians in Eastern Ukraine who were supposedly being, who were subject to great violence after the 2014 revolution, and to seize Crimea, which he saw as rightfully Russian territory because of the history of Crimea. So that helps us to understand a little bit about why he's so angry and defiant at the moment. I think it's important to keep in mind that we don't really know why now he's acting the way that he is in such an aggressive way where, we know that the nuclear weapons deterrent system has been put on high alert. Some speculate it has to do with his age. He's 69, maybe that he's not well, maybe not healthy. He's been in isolation because of the pandemic. There are other thoughts that maybe he's not quite with it, that something's going on with his mental state. But I do want to emphasize that what we're seeing is a kind of continuation of his earlier projection of power, which is a reassertion of a virile Russia in the face of a hostile other, and a reassertion of his masculinity and his ability to supposedly to protect the Russian peoples, both at home and abroad in other countries. That was the first thing I wanted to talk about. The second thing I wanted to talk about is some of his claims. Putin has talked about the need to promote the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, and to protect Russians who have been, quote, suffering persecution and genocide by the Kyiv regime for the past 8 years. And I want to just emphasize both of these justifications are based on lies by the Russian government. Ukraine is not controlled by Nazis or fascists, despite the growth of ultranationalist and fascist groups in recent years, which is not unique to Ukraine, it's a global phenomenon, right? In fact, the fascist ultranationalists have very little power in Ukraine compared to some other countries, okay? Ukraine's president, Zelensky, was democratically elected, and he is a Jewish president, Ukrainian citizen, born Russian-speaking. And his great uncles were murdered during the Holocaust. He is no Nazi, right? So why does Putin use this rhetoric? Why is he talking about denazification? Why is he talking about the threat of the fascists? And I want to suggest to you that it's important because it's powerful, because it evokes the memory of the immense suffering of the Soviet people during World War II, which involved the death of 27 million citizens, 27 million. And World War II in Russia today is not just a horrific event of the past. It is central to Russian national identity and cultural identity and pride. So Putin is utilizing this language to provoke fear and he's hoping to promote unity in the face of a common and well-known enemy, those Nazis, those fascists. And it's important to understand that why would this resonate, or why is this World War II, the Great Patriotic War, as it was called in Russia, why is this so central today? Putin has deliberately cultivated the commemoration of World War II, the Great Patriotic War, by promoting Victory Day as the most important holiday in Russia and using the war to increase nationalist pride among Russians, right? This was a great moment for Russians and the Soviet people defeating Hitler and the Nazis and fascist forces and saving the world. There's a reason to be proud. The Soviet Union played a huge role, right? But he's really promoted the celebration. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Victory Day was really not much of anything. There were a few veteran groups who would march, but there was no big celebration sponsored by the state. And he has really changed that by, over the years, increasing the amount of military might and other activities to celebrate May 9th, Victory Day. I was in Russia in 2019 during Victory Day. And during this time, he mobilized 13,000 troops, World War II era T-34 tanks, and massive missile carriers to march or to parade in Moscow streets, attended by, really literally hundreds of thousands of people, because there was the official holiday and 3 rehearsals. So 3 days in the 2 weeks leading up, streets were closed and massive, tank displays out my window and all these people that would come and cheer them on. So it wasn't just a one-day affair. So again, this is in stark contrast to the way that Victory Day was celebrated after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He also has really helped to promote what's called the Immortal Regiment. And this is something that was organic that emerged among Russian citizens, but then he's really promoted it. And this is Russian citizens carrying placards, and I should say people of other ethnic descent in Russia, carrying placards of their Soviet ancestors, their Russian, their Ukrainian, their ancestors who died during World War II, to make it, World War II again, a very central part of now, not just historic memory. And also replacing the veterans who are no longer alive to march, increasingly, right? So we need to understand Putin's comments about denazification and demilitarization in this broader cultural landscape of the Great Patriotic War. He also has reminded Russians repeatedly about the Ukrainian fascists who, a very small number of Ukrainians during World War II, fought for Ukraine's independence by allying itself with Hitler's forces and organizing combat units who led huge ethnic cleansing campaigns, particularly against the Poles. So again, he's trying to evoke fear and the memory and the sense of unity. I'm almost done with my comments, but let me just say a few more things about the use of fascism. During the Cold War and even before the Cold War, Western powers were depicted as fascist, right? So fascist capitalists who believed in terrible values, who were, going to do terrible things. This was a central part of Cold War propaganda. So when he talks about Nazis and fascists today, he's also hearkening back to those earlier images of the West as the enemy, right? And I think, he's really hoping that this will resonate with people, particularly in light of the, emphasis on the wrong ways of the West and the wrong values. Again, the support for LGBTQ+ rights was a huge deal in Russia. There's been anti-gay policies passed and just a lot of terrible things. So Putin's lies and distortions of history are intended to convey the idea that the expansion of NATO is a threat on the very existence of Russia, and that Russia is encircled by enemies. And, using the memory of World War II and the Cold War to try to harness people to believe in what he's saying. His use of the charge of genocide also needs to be understood in this context, right? Saying that there's genocide being perpetrated against those Russians who are living in Eastern Ukraine, which is not true, right? But he's trying to promote himself as Russia's savior, as the father protector, and as the one who will stand up. And conveniently, all of this also justifies imperial expansion because he's going to protect the Russians elsewhere who are being treated terribly. I want to suggest, though, that he's made a big mistake. He has really miscalculated because World War II has multiple meanings for people. And many Russians remember Ukrainians fighting alongside them, brothers, comrades in arms, and that they suffered at the hands of the German armed forces. They were also targeted racially as Slavic peoples for extermination, and that they have this in common. They have a common history of working together, never mind the family connections and the other linguistic connections and other cultural connections that we can point to. So, and I think what's important, we can really see this in the protests that are happening in Russia today. People are protesting unlike what we've seen in any recent time. And to protest in Russia is to really take a huge risk. People disappear, they get fined a huge amount, they lose their jobs, they get beaten up. It's not, for the faint of heart. And I think that we can understand this partly as that sort of shame that many Russians feel that Russia is acting as the aggressor. Russia has attacked a smaller sovereign country that does not deserve to be invaded and to be violated in the way that it is being right now. So thank you.
Great. Well, good evening. I wanted to start off with a quote from Winston Churchill, who said, "I'm an optimist because I have to be." And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind as we think about this. There are all kinds of reasons here to really get lost in sort of fear and despair over all the terrible things that are going on. But there could be good outcomes of this too. So I don't want to minimize the risks here. The risks are huge. But I want to say a little bit about why we might have grounds for taking a more hopeful view of how this is going to turn out. So the first thing I would say along those lines is that I think there's a big chance here that Putin is not going to end up accomplishing what he wants to accomplish, in part because he has two sort of incompatible goals. One thing that he really wants is to have a client state in Ukraine. And what I mean by a client state is basically, a government in Ukraine that is going to align itself with Russian foreign policy interests, and is going to be subservient to Russia in a lot of ways, at least in the foreign policy realm. I don't think he cares that much about sort of domestic policy in Ukraine, but he cares a lot about how Ukraine positions itself in terms of foreign policy. And as the other speakers have already suggested, he doesn't, not at all happy about the fact that Ukraine is sort of getting closer to NATO, right? So he would like a sort of a subservient client government in Ukraine. He also, though, lived through the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. That was a huge disaster for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, had a Soviet army in Afghanistan for 10 years, and eventually was driven out by the Afghan resistance. He does not want a long-term military occupation of Ukraine. He knows that if he gets into a position for a long-term military occupation of Ukraine, it's going to turn out badly for Russia. But I think the reality is that it's going to be very hard. I mean, it's not that hard. Look, Russia has overwhelming military power here. They, at some point, can sort of overrun the Ukrainian resistance and install a client government. But that client government, in order to actually continue to act as the government of Ukraine, is going to need to be propped up by the Soviet military. And if he tries to pull the military out, that government is likely to fall because it's going to be very unpopular with the Ukrainian people. And so he's getting himself sucked into a situation where there may well be a long-term Russian military occupation of Ukraine. And that's going to lead to massive resistance from the Ukrainian people, as we're already seeing now, right? And, you know, similar to what happened to the Soviets in Afghanistan, what happened to the United States in Iraq, frankly, you know, a foreign military power, the longer it stays as a sort of an occupying power, the more unpopular it gets. And the more the people are likely to stand up and resist. And if you talk to sort of, you know, military leaders, one thing they will all tell you is that ultimately what determines the outcome of war is the will to fight. If you don't have the will to fight, you're not going to win. If you do have the will to fight, ultimately you're going to sort of prevail, right? And I think what we're going to see here, in fact, there's already reports coming out of Ukraine that you have Russian soldiers in Ukraine who are looking around saying, why are we fighting these people? They look like us. They are like us, right? So the Russian military is going to have a hard time maintaining discipline and actually maintaining a will to fight among the Russian soldiers. And I think the Ukrainian people are going to have a very strong will to fight and eventually will sort of drive out the Russian invaders, you know? Now, obviously there are no guarantees. Others might say this is an excessively rosy picture, but I don't think it's an unrealistic picture of what might well happen, right? So that's a, you know, that's a sort of a more optimistic view, but I should add, you know, that could take years and there'd be a lot of death and destruction in the process and it won't be a pretty picture. And the Ukraine that emerges from that is going to be economically devastated and it's going to take a lot of rebuilding, right? So it's not going to be easy. All right, so I want to turn from that and talk a little bit about international law. And I think actually international law is an important part of the picture of the forces that are working against Putin right now. So probably the most central rule of international law is states are not supposed to use their military forces to invade other states. This is codified in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter. The United Nations Charter is sort of the central legal document creating the international legal order that emerged after World War II. I actually am working on a book right now that is supposed to be out later this year or maybe next year. I'm still not sure on the timing. That is called, Is the International Legal Order Unraveling? That's the title. And it's an edited volume with a bunch of contributors. And one of my contributing authors sent me a short email yesterday saying, well, it looks like Putin wants to make the title of your book the central question of 2022. You know? And this is a question a lot of people are asking in light of this invasion. This is a clear violation of really what is arguably the sort of central rule of international law. There are a lot of other rules, but this is an important one, right? Don't use military force to invade other states. So does this violation mean that the international legal order is unraveling? I don't think so, because if you look at what the community of states is doing in response to this violation, what you see is that, you know, a whole lot of other states are starting to stand up for this sort of important ethical principle, right, of not invading other states. And to understand this, I'm going to also go back and invoke a little bit of history here. So the modern international political system really goes back to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 that ended what was then the 30 Years' War. And what emerged from the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 was the modern system of nation states. We didn't really have a world organized around nation states before that time, but nation states are sort of the central organizing principle of the modern international order. For roughly 300 years, there actually was no legal rule that said it's not okay for one nation state to invade another nation state. And so it happened all the time, right? And what we had was a rule that was, or a world order, if you will, that was based to a large extent on the principle that might makes right. There were some international legal rules out there, but in general, it was accepted that it was okay for one state to invade another state. So if this was happening 100 years ago, you wouldn't see this kind of international response that we're seeing today. What you would see is a bunch of states essentially shrugging their shoulders and saying, "Ah, well, this is the way the world works," right? But that's not what we're seeing today. What we're seeing is a huge mobilization of forces against Russia. We're seeing it from the people of Ukraine who are standing up and fighting really bravely against forces that have them tremendously outnumbered and outgunned, right? But they're not rolling over and playing dead. They're fighting back, and they're putting up fierce resistance at the moment, right? We're seeing, as Professor Randall said, dissent within Russia, pushing back against Russia. We're seeing a coordinated effort by the United States and the European Union and other states to impose the most massive economic sanctions on Russia that basically any state has ever been subjected to. I mean, what's going on with the economic sanctions is truly unprecedented, and it's having an impact on Russia already. Russia's economy is going to be ruined as a result of this, right? So we're also seeing, major efforts to basically arm and support the Ukrainian people. So the Ukrainian military has been getting lots of weapons and lots of ammunitions from the United States, from NATO, from other countries. And that's continuing, right? Now, one of the key questions here that I think is a big question mark is, will Russia be able to sort of shut down those supply lines? If Russia can shut down those supply lines, that's going to make a huge difference. But so far, we haven't had too much difficulty sort of getting military support into Ukraine. And I'm hopeful that that military support will continue because the Ukrainians can't fight back against the Russians unless they have some outside help. And they're getting lots of outside help at the moment. And certainly the goal is to continue that outside help if Russia is not able to shut it down, right? So all of these factors are pushing back against Russia. And you can see this as the international community's sort of message to Russia that Article 2.4 of the UN Charter is really important. When we say states shouldn't use their military forces to invade other states, we mean it. And, if you do that, there are going to be really severe consequences, right? And we're seeing those consequences play out today. I should also say, and Professor Curry mentioned this, but the Eastern Europeans for the last 6 or 7 years, a lot of those states in Eastern Europe have been very hostile to admitting refugees from other countries. But right now they're opening their arms, right? And you look at the map and you've got actually 4 NATO countries bordering Ukraine. So Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania are all members of NATO. They're also members of the EU, but with differing statuses within the European Union. Hungary and Poland in particular have been very hostile to the influx of refugees, but they're opening themselves up, and this is another way of sort of supporting what's going on in Ukraine. So I think what we're going to see is a coordinated international effort to push back against Putin. And, there's no guarantee that that will succeed, but I also think that we shouldn't just sort of throw up our hands and say, everything is collapsing around us, that the remaining chapters have yet to be written, and we'll see where it goes. So let me stop there and turn it back over to Alice.
Great, thank you very much. And let's have a round of applause for our professors. Thank you all. So what we'd like to do now is to turn to questions from all of you here and people also on Zoom. What I'd like to remind you about is to be brief in your questions and be to the point so that our experts can answer them and that others may ask their questions and speak up. When you ask a question, would you please state your name and perhaps something like, I'm a Santa Clara law student, or I have family in Ukraine, or something like that, that helps us understand your context. So one of the things that we'd like to start with, though, is to have a humanitarian face, a human face on the conflicts right now. So I invite any of you here or our guests on Zoom as well. Is there a story, a brief incident, something that you're aware of that perhaps hasn't been covered and shared on social media very widely, or something that might be a family member or loved one who's near dear to your heart? Is there something that really strikes you in terms of the humanitarian crisis, the human suffering?
And I'm just going to add, we're going to go back and forth between the live audience and the Zoom audience. So we'll start with the live audience, but then I'm going to sort of call on people in Zoom and we'll go back and forth.
Anybody? Yes, please, in the back. Thank you for handling the microphones.
Hello. Oh my gosh, it was really loud. I'm so sorry.